Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. This afternoon, I have the distinct pleasure of introducing one of the foremost resiliency planners in the state, nay, the nation. Amanda Martin, PhD, spent her undergrad studying history and science at a small private school in the Northeast, Harvard University. She received her master's in city planning at another small Northeastern school, MIT. Then, after realizing that New England is frigid, she completed her PhD at a far superior institution, the University of North Carolina. Student loans and now bad jokes aside, she's been a planner for the state of Rhode Island. She's helped the Southeast regional public and private sectors coalesce around best-in-class disaster resilience and recovery practices. And she's now currently our state's Deputy Chief Resilience Officer, a position that will gain importance as our natural environment and climate continues to change. So with that, Amanda, thank you very much. We look forward to hearing from you. Please take it away.
Thank you, Joel. That was a fantastic. If I ever need an advertisement for myself, I'll be sure to hit you up for that. So thank you for your ad copy. So I'm here today. My name is Amanda Martin. I'm Deputy Chief Resilience Officer with the North Carolina Office of Recovery and Resiliency. And I'm really happy to be here today to talk about building resilient communities. Just as an overview of where I'm going to go today, I'll start by introducing our Office of Recovery and Resiliency. And then I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about what resilient communities look like. We like to talk about 4 different components of resilience. And then in the final piece, I'll talk about the how. How do we get to a more resilient place? So first, as an introduction, I work for the North Carolina Office of Recovery and Resiliency. We are an office within the Department of Public Safety. We were created by the legislature in 2018 after Hurricane Florence, and the state was receiving an influx of disaster recovery funds and started to realize the amount of funds that were coming in for disaster recovery really exceeded our administrative capacity when we were trying to tuck them into existing departments and programs. So they established the Office of Recovery and Resiliency, and we did apparently a good enough job handling our disaster recovery funds that we were tapped with handling some of the COVID recovery funds that have been allocated to North Carolina from the federal government to help deal with eviction prevention. So supporting people who need help with paying rent and paying for their utilities. So at this point, we're administering over $1 billion in aid related to recovery and resiliency. We are a sibling agency to the North Carolina Division of Emergency Management. So in particular, our resilience team is pretty small, but we work closely with the Division of Emergency Management on coping with natural hazards. So what is resilience? Resilience is a word that gets used a lot, and sometimes you'll say, I don't really like that word resilience. It just means everything. It means nothing. And our opinion is that resilience, the reason that resilience gets used so much is that it's a really powerful concept, and it's not something that we necessarily have other great words for. And the analogy that I like to make is about standing next to a door that swings open. So have you ever been standing somewhere and the door swings open and you're in the way and you get, maybe get knocked over? Hopefully you don't, really get anything, a bruise or fall down or anything. But the point is that after you compose yourself, you don't go stand exactly where you were standing before. You take a step aside. So you've learned from the thing that hit you, the door that opened, you learned something. Oh, I need to not be standing there. I need to be standing somewhere else. And that's what resilience is about. Resilience is not just about getting up and regaining your composure. It's about learning from the experience that you had and putting yourself in a better place. So another way that people often think about resilience is how much time does it take to get back to normal? When can we get back to normal after we have a shock or a stress? So, a disaster, a storm, a pandemic. And we like to add to that, it's a really important component. And we like to add to that a question that, is that baseline, is that normal the best that we can be? Is that normal good enough for the future? So we like to be talking not just about bouncing back, but bouncing forward. And 3 key words that we use a lot of the time to talk about resilience are prepared, connected, and adaptive. So prepared means knowing what's coming your way. Connected means having the resources to cope when it comes. And adaptive means learning from what happened and changing what you need to change. Specifically, my team at the Office of Recovery and Resiliency looks at climate and natural hazards resilience. And I wanted to share this graphic with you all. It's from North Carolina's Climate Risk Assessment and Resilience Plan. And I'm guessing that the folks who are at this conference are generally aware of what the climate change projections are for North Carolina. Virtually certain that sea level will continue to rise. Very likely that we're going to have more hot weather, likely that we'll have more precipitation, more intense hurricanes, droughts, and an increase in inland flooding. But actually, I also wanted to share this graphic with you all because it comes from this amazing resource, which is an entire science report dedicated to projecting what climate change looks like in North Carolina. So basically took what was used for a national climate assessment, and we were very fortunate to have the contributions of something like 50 scientists who took that methodology and brought it to the state scale. So I encourage you all to use this data or use these findings anytime it makes sense for you to do that in a presentation, in a grant application. Part of what I'm here to do is to let you know about the resources that we have to help you all. So what do resilient communities look like? I'm going to talk about 4 components today that we like to focus on when we think about resilient communities. The first is land use. The second is infrastructure. The third is social and economic connectedness. And the final one is emergency preparedness. So first, land use. And when I talk about land use, if you come from a different field, I'm talking about where you put what kinds of development and where you don't. That's kind of a big picture look at what land use is. And the question that I ask here is, how do we live with the water? So we know that water, and I will say a lot of our work focuses on flooding. It's not the only hazard we think about, but we spend a lot of time working on flooding. So how do we live with water? And one way that we encourage people to think about this is that the water needs a place to go. So we need to have a place for development in our communities and a place for water. And that means particularly working with our planning departments. You'll see this is a land use plan from the town of Swansboro that's done a lot of work on understanding their climate risk and trying to look at where they're already developed, where they're not developed, and how they can intensify development in places that make sense, not just from a sort of economic development community perspective, but also from a flooding perspective. So first, do no harm. Let's not make any flooding problems worse. So maybe you're not starting with a blank slate and you can say water over there and houses over there, but take what you have in your community and let's not make it any worse. So that means avoiding building in the floodplain at all costs. It means avoid building near the floodplain. And it also means considering what happens downstream of you. So maybe you've had the experience where a new subdivision goes in near where you live and all of a sudden the road floods more than it used to. And that's because you have more buildings, more driveways, more streets, what we call impervious surface. So in adding development in one place, sometimes you make flooding worse somewhere else. And that happens in a really big scale statewide. Unfortunately, development that happens upstream, say in the Piedmont, can cause major flooding problems downstream because the water runs off so quickly from, again, impervious surfaces, buildings and streets. And it runs into our little creeks, into our tributaries, into bigger and bigger rivers. And then those communities that have always existed next to rivers, probably have always been vulnerable, are now extremely vulnerable. So climate change isn't the only change that we talk about being a problem for flooding. Development isn't a problem in and of itself, but it can exacerbate flooding problems. So encourage communities not to make their flooding problems any worse. The next component that I will talk about is infrastructure. And a lot of people, when we talk about resilient communities, a lot of folks think about infrastructure because infrastructure plays a really important part in managing floodwater in our communities. Excuse me, and I will agree with that infrastructure is a very important component of managing floodwater, but I want to encourage us also to take a big picture look at what infrastructure is. So infrastructure is a platform for building wealth in our communities, and infrastructure is very expensive. So when we build a road, you want to build it in the right place. When we build a sewer system, you only want to have to build it once. You want to keep maintenance considerations in mind. So that means when you think about infrastructure, not just your flood control infrastructure, but all your infrastructure, your wastewater systems, your water systems, you want to be considering climate change. You want to be considering what areas are expected to flood and how that might change over time. Now, an important component of infrastructure, something that we talk about more and more these days, is something we call natural infrastructure, green infrastructure. And this refers to the fact that natural lands play a role in protecting us from flooding. They have an important role to play in terms of absorbing floodwater. So especially our wetlands, our marshlands, to some degree our forests, anywhere that's not developed helps absorb rainwater. And even though it's a little bit counterintuitive, sometimes we think we just need that water to go away. When it falls, when it comes our way, we just need it off our property. But actually, if we slow the water down, that's really what we want to be doing in a big scale to reduce flooding. Because when we try to just get water off of our property, get it out of our town, get it down the stream as fast as possible, we create new problems downstream pretty consistently. And so natural infrastructure also needs to be a part of our infrastructure discussion. And so that means identifying where we have natural systems, natural lands that are playing a role in mitigating flood losses. Next, we turn to a different kind of component of resilience, which is social and economic connectedness. And I apologize, this is like my worst slide. I still don't have a good image for this slide. But this refers to the fact that when disaster happens, we as a society, as community, have ways to cope with that. And we need to flex that capacity before the disaster happens. We've learned this from a government perspective. When we have all these federal funds come in for a disaster, you can't actually fix anything just by making it rain money. You have to spend the money wisely. You have to spend the money. You have to spend the money in the right places. You have to spend the money fairly. You have to have accountability because it's public funding, and all of those things require capacity. And that's just a government example because I work in government and I told you about the origins of our office. But that kind of glue, that kind of capacity that we have in our communities to help us cope comes from all of these different places, from schools and parents and faith communities. It comes from chambers of commerce. It comes from our community health centers, our small business owners, our local media, and on and on. And you can see this is why we consider leadership and representation to be an important component of resilience. And we actually partner with an organization that does leadership development work because leadership is so important to resilience. And this is where We focus on natural hazards and climate resilience, but when we look at the component of resilience that has to do with social and economic connectedness, and this is a resilience that spans natural and other kinds of disasters. So what was really interesting is over the past year with the pandemic, we have had many of the same conversations about housing capacity, organizational capacity, how we distribute resources, that we have those same conversations with disaster relief and recovery funds. So while the social and economic connectedness piece is more diffuse than figuring out how we cope with the actual physical impacts of disaster, it's so broadly important to the other ways in which stresses and shocks can impact our communities. Then the final component of what resilient communities look like, or the fourth big one that we like to talk about, is emergency preparedness. And this is part of our close relationship with emergency management. And this is things at the very granular level of each household, having your emergency kit, kind of knowing where your key documents are. But it's also about planning for evacuation, especially for elders and for people with disabilities. It's about emergency communication and reaching communities that have been left out of emergency communications. In particular, we've had some discussions over the past year with our farm worker communities who have not received emergency communications in situations like a hurricane, in which we have days of advanced knowledge of it coming. The state provides resources to understand your flood risk. I shared a website there. We call it FRIS. It's a way to look up your FEMA designated flood risk. There are also other excellent resources that use different kinds of methodologies for you to understand your flood risk so that you can do things like purchase flood insurance. So insurance will always be a better option than a public recovery program. It's faster, it's more complete. We always encourage people to hold flood insurance. You live on a hill, you still might consider flood insurance. And then emergency preparedness also includes those emergency management components that you find. We have them in state government, but you'll also find them in every county in North Carolina. And we're lucky to have really fantastic emergency management capacity in North Carolina. They win awards, they get trophies because they do extremely critical life-saving work. So there were your four components of resilient communities: land use, infrastructure, social and economic connectedness, and emergency preparedness. So that's the what. And now I'm going to talk a little bit about the how. How do we get there? How do we craft our communities? This isn't Sim City. We already live in these communities. We're not building them fresh. How do we make our communities more resilient? And what I say is many pathways of change and action are needed. This isn't, I sit in a state office that has resiliency in its name, and I'll talk a little bit more about the work that we are doing as a state agency to advance resilience across North Carolina. But I also want to highlight there's so much important work from other kinds of actors. Local policy in particular, there are a lot of aspects of resiliency that are governed at the local levels, particularly related to land use. And so get involved in those decisions, learn how they're being made in your community. If a lot of development is happening in the floodplain in your community, learn if that's really necessary, if there are other sites that might be safer for your community. Advocacy work, and that happens at all levels of government or even advocacy to other kinds of organizations. Community building work is critical. Community organizing, both in the networks that you have. This is where our faith communities do a really tremendous amount of work, but not everybody is part of a faith community. and also creating connections between those communities and resources, basically, like, you know, your governments or your large employers or your private foundations. So both those networks of mutual aid and support, and also those connections that you have to resources that you can channel to your networks and to your communities. Along those lines, networks of knowledge and support are so important. I think we're really seeing that with the vaccination effort. You know, who's a trusted messenger for a given community really differs. And as a state government official, I can't just show up and tell people what I think is a good idea. I need to reach out to community leaders and make sure, you know, talk with them. Is my idea a good idea? Do you agree? Oh, well, if you agree, would you want to share it? Would you want to share it in your own words? Would you want to share something else that I should be working on? So networks of knowledge and support. Science and research is critical. A lot of the big decisions we have to make are based on engineering and projections about rainfall, sea level rise. Science and research are important. Federal policy is important. Investment at all levels, public and private, your own personal investment in your house, your household. My point is, whoever you are and whatever skills you bring, we need you in this effort. So a little bit about what the state has been working on. This is an image of the cover of the North Carolina Risk Assessment and Resilience Plan. It came out last June. And I'd like to acknowledge that we had analysis and planning assistance from NOAA, and also from the National Environmental Modeling and Analysis Center, otherwise known as NEMAC, which is at UNC Asheville. And we also had input in our climate justice chapter from the Department of Environmental Quality, Secretary's Environmental Justice and Equity Advisory Board. And the next slide has our table of contents. And I just want to go through a few of the items because it's so rich with findings, good ideas, strategies that I want everybody to know about this resource. It came out in the middle of a pandemic. So understandably, other things have been more urgent, but I do want to share it. It has sort of typical front matter, but then we have this climate science report, and this is actually just the summary that's in it. The full report is an appendix. But as I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, this is was peer reviewed. We had over 50 scientists participating, and it's very deliberate in its language, very careful in stating the likelihood. So when you need science and science findings about what's going on in North Carolina with respect to climate change, this is a fantastic resource. We have a climate and environmental justice chapter. I am I feel personally about this chapter. I was the lead author on it. And it discusses the ways in which climate change affects people unequally and some of the reasons for that, everything from, you know, unequal exposure and redlining and discrimination to the structure of our existing policies and the ways that we invest in resilience. That chapter represents the state's interest and commitment in advancing environmental justice and justice through its climate resilience efforts. Chapter 5 crosses all of those sectors that you can see those little pictures of. It discusses resilience and resilience strategies, everything from agriculture to public health to historic preservation to energy systems, ecosystems. So whatever your interest is, if it falls into one of those, you should check out what that chapter has to say about it. Finally, there's a section on nature-based solutions to resilience, and that's when I was talking about natural infrastructure. There's a fantastic chapter on strategies to use nature to help us become more resilient as a piece of the puzzle. And finally, it ends with strategies, a path forward that our Office of Recovery and Resiliency has been picking off pieces of. So one other thing the state is working on, and then I will stop talking, is a Resilient Communities program. And this is a means for the state to bring leadership capacity, training, technical assistance on resilience to smaller geographies, to regions and local communities. So I'm not going to go through, this is kind of a bullet point slide of the goals of the program. I did want to put in a quick plug for RISE. We have 2 resilient communities programs in the state. One of them is RISE. It's the program that my office is working on with the North Carolina Rural Center. And it's funded by the Economic Development Administration. And through RISE, we're offering leadership development training in Eastern North Carolina and supporting regional coalitions in developing resilience plans, also in storm impacted Eastern North Carolina. And I'm happy to answer more questions about that if you have them, or feel free to reach out. That's a program that we are just launching now. I think I'll skip the RISE goals. And I'll leave you with a slide about resilience thinking every day, just to emphasize that everybody has a role in building resilient communities. And that includes connecting inside and outside of your community. It includes understanding future risks, whether those risks have to do with the climate or they have to do with other kinds of changes or socioeconomic disparities, understanding the situation that we're in, the risks that we face. Avoiding future suffering, that's just kind of a mantra that we try to put in people's minds about what we're doing here, is we're avoiding future suffering. Invest and upgrade wisely, thinking about future changes when you make investments so that those investments last the lifetime that they're designed to last. And then integrating resilience across sectors and roles. And this is to say that there's a piece of resilience for all of us, no matter where you are, and we need everybody's participation to get there. So that's the conclusion of my slides. And I don't know if there are specific questions or if anyone's interested in a discussion about what resilience looks like in their community.
Yeah, we've got a few. And I think I'll have a few too. I'll take the prerogative to ask a few questions as well. Roxanne Newton asks, how are counties and municipalities working with the NCORR to align practices and policies for better outcomes? And I might build on that a little bit and throw in there, how are you guys doing interagency coordination as well?
Sure. So I have there's a few different things that we're doing. So the Resilient Communities program is the big way that we are reaching counties and regions in aligning their resilience efforts, understanding the risks that they face, the options that they have. And we, I will say there is an unbounded need for that work. And right now we have 4 staff people and 1 person to do that. So we do always respond when people reach out to us with questions about, oh, I want to do a resilience plan, or I'm interested in wastewater issues or something. We always try to point them to appropriate resources, but that's certainly something we would like to do more of, just because there's such tremendous need. And then in terms of the interagency collaboration, collaboration across state government, we do that in a few ways. One is we staff our State Disaster Recovery Task Force, which is a very large body that operates through subcommittees that we call recovery support functions. And I just say that in case anybody hears the term RSF. That's what they're talking about. And so these are sector-based groups of state and non-state organizations that come together to collaborate on recovery and resiliency issues. So our most active ones are housing, nonprofit and volunteerism, environmental preservation. We also have a business and workforce and agriculture. We're starting a transportation one. That's a big way that we do our interagency collaboration. We also have an interagency resilience team, IRT. I think it's a team, might be a task force. Anyway, and these are staff level folks from across agencies that work on resilience issues. And we get together to share with one another what we're doing, talk about our challenges, how we're overcoming them. And actually, you will see pretty shortly, we're going to come out, each of the cabinet agencies developed a report on what they're doing with respect to resilience and what they expect to be doing in the next year. And so those were due in early March, and we're turning them around, and they should be made public in the fairly near future. So you might also look to those to see what some of the agencies are doing.
If there are any reporters on the call, there you go. Just broke some news right there. Danielle Kuntz asks, does NCORR rank counties according to their flood risk and flood preparedness? How does the Office of Resilience and Recovery impact corporate development in flood-prone areas?
Well, the second question is easy. We don't influence any land use decisions. Those are tend to be made by local governments per their legal authorities. We don't rank counties according to their flood risk and flood preparedness, but we do try to make sure that people are aware of their county's flood risk and that they improve their flood preparedness. So this is everything from supporting local hazard mitigation plans to increasing understanding about insurance options, communicating about emergency management, providing emergency communications. So I will say we tend to work in those, we have been historically working in those counties that have been worst impacted by Hurricanes Matthew and Florence, and that has to do with a lot of our federal funding. A certain percentage of it has to be spent in those most impacted and distressed counties. So in some ways we focus on places where we know the problem is the most severe.
Cool, great. We are actually, I believe, just out of time, though we do have more questions. Let me see. Let me go back to go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna, let me share my my email in the chat. I see some great questions. I'm happy to answer by email or send them to somebody who has more more knowledge if it's something specific.
Please do. Please do reach out, folks. If you can't tell, she's great, and these are great questions, so I don't want to let them go by the wayside. But thank you everybody for tuning in, and Amanda, doing great work. Thank you very much. We appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you for these great questions too.
All right, and I'd encourage everybody to return to Huva, and we will be wrapping up probably now, it looks like. So thank you.